Good evening and welcome to this edition of the Slave Food Project, where two African American physicians explore the role of racism as a unique form of stress and the weaponization of food in the creation of health disparities in African American communities, irrespective of income. They discover eating a whole food, plant-based diet in urban communities is possible and is the key to eliminating health disparities. Our doctors are Dr. Columbus Batiste, a cardiologist out of Southern California, and Dr. Eric Walsh. Hello, guys. How are you?
Good. How you doing?
Well, good to see you again.
Good to see you guys. Yep.
Today, the doctors are joined by Michael Moss, who is the author of Salt, Sugar, Fat: How the Food Giants Hook Us, an expose on the processed food industry that became a #1 New York Times bestseller for nonfiction and is now translated into 20 languages. Wow. He was awarded a Pulitzer Prize in 2010 for his reporting on contaminated meat and was a finalist in 2008 for his work on the Pentagon's failure to equip soldiers in Iraq with body armor. He lives in Brooklyn with his wife and their 2 boys. His next book, entitled Hooked: Food, Free Will, and How the Food Giants Exploit Our Addictions, is being published by Random House in March 2021. Welcome, Mr. Moss, to our show. Everyone, have a good show.
Thanks, Jeanette.
Thank you.
Oh, what a pleasure this is. You know, when we first connected, you were out there getting your physical activity on. I interrupted a sprint through Central Park, and you were so gracious to take a little time to chat with me. How are you? How's the family?
I'm really good. The family is great. Thank you.
Yeah, very good to have you on. You're one of our most quoted and referenced people we talk about because of the incredible work that is that first book, and we are super excited for your second book. We will be promoting it nonstop because we believe that the more people, especially African Americans, read these books, the more empowered they will be to be liberated from a lot of what causes diseases in our community. So your work is groundbreaking. It is unrivaled, and we are honestly privileged and honored to have you on with us tonight to talk about these things.
Well, it's great to be here, and it's great to see you again, too, especially Dr. Walsh, because as we talked about, we had met a few years ago on a panel discussing, and it was in Southern California,
Yep.
the public health organization, and you were talking about sort of the health impacts of bad eating habits and the manipulation by food companies kind of in communities of color. And I was really struck by your insight on the incredible difficulty people were having regaining control over their eating habits, given what the companies were doing. So it's really great to see you again and have a fuller. I've been looking forward to having a fuller conversation now with both of you. So here we are.
All right. Love it. Let's dive in. You know, one of the things that really jumped out to me when I read your book 3 times, I do have to say, you know, I listened to it, and then bought it and took a look through things again, was that growing up, I grew up inside of Compton, which is an area inside of South Central Los Angeles. And so one of my dad's favorite drinks was Dr. Pepper. So the story that you uncovered talking about Howard Markowitz and the whole Dr. Pepper was really impactful for me. It really resonated with me, and it got me really thinking about processed foods and really this whole interplay. Tell the audience, tell us about what is, everything's processed, but ultra processed and what happens inside these factories. Give us a little peer insight into that.
Yeah, sure. So, a little definition, right? These days people talk about ultra processed food, and it's sort of defined as, you could also call it hyper processed food, because not every sort of processing in the food business is necessarily a problem for you from a health perspective. But ultra processing sort of means food that's been so manipulated by technological processes to make it convenient so it can sit on the shelf for months at a time without spoiling, really low cost, and utterly irresistible taste-wise, to the point where it doesn't even resemble the original foodstuffs that go into it. So, for example, sugary breakfast cereal that's puffed through this large machine that almost looks like a gun-like process, a cannon, would be considered ultra-processed food, as opposed to, say, milk or cheese, something which has, or frozen peas, which are, theoretically processed, but not in the ultra processed way that food is. So that's kind of what we're talking about. And by and large, it resides in that 90% of the grocery store that's in the middle of the store, not the side where the produce is or the side where the dairy and meat is, but the center part of the store, which is by and large the most treacherous part of the store for us to go shopping, because it can often be very difficult to tell good food from bad when you're in the middle part of that store. And I became really fascinated by the processed food industry, ultra processed food industry, if you will, and did the research and the writing for that resulted in salt, sugar, fat. And the thing I think that really made it for the book, made it resonates with people, is that I was so lucky to come across this trove of documents that took me inside the largest food companies as they were inventing, marketing, positioning their iconic brands in the grocery store. And it was those documents that allowed me to identify key people in the industry who I then managed to get to talk to me. They revealed even more secrets. And I have to tell you that the overwhelming sense that I certainly got from that material in those interviews of insiders is that this is an industry that's been driving day and night to get us to not just like their food, the products, but to want more and more of them.
Is that why they have these psychobiologists and chemists that are there?
Yes. So you mentioned Howard Moskowitz. I mean, the companies hire consultants or have on staff experts who know how to formulate. Some of them are chemists, some of them are psychologists. Howard Moskowitz is one of my favorite characters because he was trained in high math at Queens College and then experimental psychology at Harvard. And Howard went to work at one point for Dr. Pepper, the soda company. And he took me through his process. They wanted to come up with a new flavor. And Howard went after that goal by creating something like no less than 60 different versions of sweetness, subjected those to some 3,000 or 4,000 taste tests around the country, took the data and put it in his computer, and out comes this, high math regression analysis curve. It looked like a bell-shaped curve like that. And at the top of the curve is the perfect amount of sugar that sends us over the moon and their products flying off the shelf, not too little, not too much. And it was Howard who coined the term the bliss point, which the industry began using internally to describe that perfect amount of sweetness that would wow the brain and be irresistible to us.
Wow.
Let me jump in. Let me jump in and say, when I read the book the first time, that's what floored me.
Yes.
I think someone who grew up in neighborhoods where I grew up outside of Hartford, Connecticut, live in Connecticut now. And in our old neighborhoods, especially in the city in the city of Hartford, where my grandmother lived, there were corner stores, and this is the stuff that this was their bread and butter. I mean, when we think of inner city corners, we think of drug dealers.
Oh man!
But as I've grown older, what I realize is probably the biggest negative pusher in those neighborhoods are the people who push something that they have designed, literally with an intentionality. And I think what really blew me away when I read your book was there's an intention. The reason that many of us struggle with weight and have a difficult time losing it is in our formative and developmental years, we're literally being fed food that someone sat down in a very sophisticated way and designed that we would not be able to eat just a little bit of it and that we want it back again the next day.
Yeah. I mean, you could look at them as this evil empire that intentionally set out to make us overweight or otherwise ill with food, or not. But I look at them more as companies doing what all companies want to do, which is to sell as much product as possible by to make as much money as possible. And their entire goal is to make their products, luscious and cheap and convenient so that we can't resist them. And it's a very fine line between being able to control and say, eat one handful of potato chips or half a soda, and losing control. I think that's something the companies have never fully owned up to, is the fine line between those two things.
But I want you to touch on something real quick. So when you described the bliss point, you described as this sort of mark between too sweet versus just perfect, not too little, not too much, just right. Tell us about how they crafted according to gender or to ethnicity, and because that was a very interesting component of your book.
So I looked really hard at that because one of their older scientists who worked for this company called General Foods helped invent and market that product Tang. Do you remember that? Like the astronauts began drinking that. It's like a powdered sugary drink. And he was trying to sell it to China. And he noticed as he sort of went south in the country, people wanted a sweeter version of the Tang. And he was one of the first people to sort of pick up on that. People can have different likes for sweetness in different parts of the country, maybe also by gender, maybe also by race. There is some research showing that Black folks have a higher liking of sugar than white, and likewise Hispanics. The question really comes into this, though, sort of the chicken and egg, which is that a born higher liking of sweetness, or is that something we Black people come to through habit, through experience? And one of my favorite sort of scientists in the foods industry said to me recently that, look, Michael, it's, as much as we like sugar, I like to think that we like what we eat more than we eat what we like, meaning what we get used to through habit and memory is what dictates our eating habits. So that would be now it's incumbent upon us to look really hard at the marketing aspects of these companies just to see how effective they were in marketing their products to people who were the most vulnerable, to liking those products, wanting more and more, and also the health consequences of that.
We had on a food, Columbus, was he a food scientist?
Yes.
Of the was in Africa?
Yes.
Brilliant guy. And he said something similar to what you just said. And he used the phrase, the business of business is business. He said, don't get too mad at these companies. They're trying to, he didn't say don't get too mad at them, but his point was, they're in business. They're trying to make money. So they're trying to make a product that's going to make them more money than it did last year. They're trying to make money that way. I guess for us, though, there's two things. As an African-American physician and someone who's worked in public health, there's two things. One of them is, how much of the stress of being Black in America or Latino in America is taken into consideration? Because there's one other component that you didn't mention, and that is, we know that comfort foods are, the more stressed you are, the more people kind of turn to quote unquote comfort foods. So could some of why Black people like sugar more, just to use it as a general thing, have something to do with something we talk a lot about in our presentations, which is the inherent stress of being Black in America. And so, as kind of the first part of it. And I guess the second part of it would be the tobacco industry could have made pretty much the same argument around their product as they made cigarettes more and more addicting. The difference is they lied and said it wasn't addicting. So maybe the food industry hasn't done that. And maybe you could answer that. How far has the food industry gone in revealing that, in fact, they are intentionally trying to make the food habit forming in a sense?
Yeah, they try to walk a real narrow line in terms of the addiction thing. They hate the A word, addiction. But when they're talking to each other about doing things to maximize the allure of their products, they talk about things like snackability, craveability. And one of my favorite terms they use is more-ishness, as in more and more. And if you think about it, to them, it just kind of has made sense that, of course, we're going to make our products as alluring as possible. We're not going to own up to addiction per se, but but we're in the business of selling products. So I mean, going back to what you said, I think we can be mad at the companies, absolutely, because look, I mean, I started Salt, Sugar, Fat with this secret meeting by the heads of the largest companies. This is way back in 1999, when obesity and diabetes was much more manageable than it is now. They got together because a cabal of insiders in some of those companies became concerned about their culpability in making us sick with and overly dependent on their products. And we're urging the companies to do something way back then to change their ways to help us. And you could probably guess what happened. Almost nothing came out of that meeting. Obesity skyrocketed, diabetes, gout, and our dependence on processed foods has continued to increase. With today, we should mention the pandemic. At no time has sort of what we eat mattered more than it does right now. And that's the other equation of looking at communities of color, African Americans, is not only the attraction that we may have to food, or those communities may have special attraction in terms of comfort, and sugar is a pain reliever to babies. But it's then the next step of that, which is the access to healthcare in order to deal with problems that arise from a bad diet that's overly dependent on ultra processed food.
Yeah, Michael, one of the things I oftentimes will say to my patients is that, I'll ask them simple questions, and there's usually a two-part. Did you enjoy coffee the very first time you tasted coffee? Did you enjoy alcohol the first time you tasted alcohol, if you drink alcohol? And invariably, the answer is no. But I follow up with, but you kept doing it, and you acquired the taste because of the way it made you feel. And so I think that's an equation of what happens many times with any group, is that they may have an initial attraction to it, and sugars doesn't take much to kind of get an affinity towards sugar, and there's an immediate attraction there that occurs inside of these communities. And so that, I think, is one of the biggest problems, that along with something you bring out oftentimes, which is the vanishing calories. I don't know if you want to touch on that as well.
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm an investigative journalist. I'm trained to follow the money, and there's a $1.5 trillion in the processed food industry for me to follow and look at and see how that manipulates our eating habits. But I also fell in love with the language that they use to describe the engineering that goes into their products. And they love to talk about the Cheetos as being one of the heights of food engineering, because when you put that crisp into your mouth and just sort of press your tongue against the roof of your mouth, it melts, which actually is another characteristic of ultra processed food, which is you don't have to chew it very much, if at all. It's designed to kind of melt in your mouth. But they discovered that when that snack melts in your mouth, it sends a signal to your brain that the calories have melted away, and you don't need to have any concern about overeating them. Eat as many, eat the whole bag if you want. And so they came up with this expression, the vanishing caloric density, to describe that, what they consider to be sort of a miracle aspect of their technology that goes into their products.
Wow. So they actually created and constructed these products that I grew up loving. Let's put aside all things. I've let them go now. But where the mouthfeel, it seems as if in my brain processes it, that I haven't really eaten as much as I've eaten as I make my way through a bag of whatever, chips or...
So I have to tell you, it's even worse than that, though. You mentioned the next book I've been writing. I can hold it up if you want to see, because the cover is sort of a little, here, let me put it right in the middle there. So this came up over the question, which I got immediately after Salt, Sugar, Fat, is, so Michael, though, is this stuff really addictive like drugs? And I have to say I was very skeptical of that. But after researching Hooked, the next book, I have to tell you that in some ways, food is even more addictive than alcohol, cigarettes, and drugs.
Wow.
And one of the big ways that is that they are making these products in a way that reaches into our deepest emotional
Mm.
instincts. So if you believe in evolution, as I do, we go back 4 million years to when we separated from chimpanzees, stood up, began walking, and that had profound effects on our body, our biology, the way we were attracted to food. So our liking and our being drawn to food that's inexpensive, that's variable, like an all-you-can-eat diner, that's
Mhm.
colorful, and that's highly caloric, has a lot of calories in it, goes way back in time and is as powerful as is not, if not more powerful than salt, sugar, fat as sort of their main ingredients, as well as the memories that we form for food go way back to our early childhood, maybe even the womb. What our mother first feeds us and father first feeds us forms very strong memories, especially through adolescence, that stay with us through life. Whereas, drug memories, alcohol memories tend to start in the late teens and perhaps end in the mid 20s, and so it's a much smaller scope. So that combination of sort of deep instinct for things that are characteristic of ultra processed food, as well as sort of our memory and our habit forming abilities, plus the fact that, if you feel you have a bad habit with processed food, it's really hard. You can't just go cold turkey on food altogether like you can with drugs, right? We have to eat. And we're constantly bombarded by advertising and marketing for the products we're trying to avoid. So kind of for some of those reasons, I came to the conclusion that in those key ways, food is actually even more problematic and addictive in that sense as drugs can be.
Yeah.
Well, I was going to say, in some of the talks we do, we talk about how much advertising of these unhealthy foods are forward facing to Black children. And there's research, I don't remember if it was Pew, but Pew research that said that actually Black children watch more of this food advertised to them than any other children in the country. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Certain programming on television is targeted, that they think Black children will watch more, and Black children watch more television in general. Again, it just seems a bit nefarious almost, but I get your point. I think this is why I think this information needs to get out there. I think people need to know that their kids like some of the stuff, not simply because they just happen to buy it, but because it was designed to be liked a lot and it was advertised to their child, that it is something that they should eat. And the other thing I wanted to mention, you mentioned access to healthcare and managing these things afterwards. For us as physicians, I think the worst thing that can happen to you is that your fate lie in the medical industrial complex in the United States. To avoid it is really the best thing. So, as we push for access, which obviously is very important, we really are trying to say, how do we get people to prevent the need for that access in the first place, in terms of, being on diabetes medicines the rest of their life? Because the other side of your books is on one side you're hooked to the food, the other side now you're hooked to the medications to treat the diseases that the food brought into kind of brought into existence in the first place.
And there's some really cool ways we can fight back. I did a series of live Facebook shows 2 weeks ago, I guess. We titled it Unhooked, because I sort of had this realization that many of these things we're kind of talking about that the food companies do to get us hooked on their products, they didn't actually invent whole cloth. They took them from us and corrupted them to their own ends, if you will. So obviously they didn't invent sugar. We use sugar, and good cooks, healthy cooks will use salt, sugar, and fat in their recipes to healthful effects. And so I just sort of had this notion that one of the ways that we can change our eating habits and empower ourselves to make decisions over what we eat is to take back those things that the food companies took from us and turn them to our own advantage, whether it's convenience or lower cost or yumminess. It was a lot of fun doing that show and looking at how we can turn the tables, if you will, on the food giants now to regain control. Because again, food has never mattered as much as it is now, and if we eat correctly, it can be so empowering and such a positive force to keeping ourselves healthier than we otherwise would be, and avoiding all the health issues out there.
Yeah, no, that's powerful, and I love that. And oftentimes I'll touch on making convenience work for you, but changing the narrative in terms of having whole foods, real foods that are frozen or canned, or things that the food giants may process or package in a particular way that gives it sustainability. But I want to go back to a little bit to some of the things you brought up about advertisement, and humor me with this theory that we put forth. And it's kind of, we pull from multiple sources. Chen Zhou's book on supersizing urban America and the color of law and various aspects there. But when you look at how food is subsidized, I want you to speak to how food is subsidized through our government. That may lead into processed foods. We also look at how advertisement is subsidized, dairy checkoff and so forth, for these fast food companies, and how these are all cradled inside of urban communities. And it could be Black, it could be brown, it could be white, various aspects. But inside these urban communities, we have these crucibles that you have just the perfect storm between all these over subsidized, ultra processed foods that are funded by the government, that are then to as well, advertisement is paid through our tax dollars. And it seems as if it's a setup for failure in what to one extent for individuals, just like what you've mentioned, where at a young age, they develop this brand recognition. I remember as a kid, and for the most part, we were fairly healthy, but I remember eating these chocolate covered candies that had an initial on it. And one of the first things I ever did was I used my own money to buy these candies, and it became my favorite candy until I kind of gave it up after a while. And so that brand recognition seemed to just go throughout the decades. And so I don't know if you have any thoughts on any of those things.
Well, sure. And just a quick thought on you as a child. I mean, that experience of using a little bit of your own money to make an initial purchase decision is golden to the companies, because they know that creates a memory and a brand loyalty that'll stick with you for life. I mean, you might not have that candy for 50 years, but the next time you smell it or see it or hear someone eating it, it's going to take you back in memory right to that time. And you're going to have, if not cravings, certainly those feelings of liking that you had as a child. Very powerful stuff. Yeah, their ability to sort of market and brand their products to hit our emotional buttons, if you will, can't be overstated. I write about the Lunchable product, which was invented as a way to sell more processed cheese and processed ham that Kraft had a surplus of. And the way they sold it eventually, and frankly, when they invented these little trays with bits of cheese and ham and crackers, the inventors of it at the company didn't think it would sell at all. But when they queried kids, and they came up with a marketing slogan, which was, all day you got to do what they say, but lunchtime is all yours. They were doing what they're best at, which is finding those emotional buttons that get us to eat when we're not even hungry and wanting to eat. And going back to the government role, I mean, I was really struck by how some of the big federal agencies that are supposedly there, funded by us to regulate the food companies on behalf of us, are in fact being used by the food companies to make more money and sell more product. And the number one, of course, is the Department of Agriculture, where the vast majority of research and development money goes into making two things cheaper and more available: soybeans and field corn that goes into high fructose corn syrup and animal feed. Those are two main ingredients in ultra processed food. A much, much smaller portion of the government funding for research and development, as well as the corporate funding for that, goes into trying to make vegetables and fruits more affordable, accessible, tastier for people. So over the years, what used to be called the People's Department, the Department of Agriculture, has become, the industry's, own agent for increasing profits.
Mm, mm, mm. Wow. Wow. Yeah, no, that's something else in terms of this relationship between the government and between some of these food products that we entertain. And when you look at this, I mean, what are your thoughts really of the role of the tobacco industry as they've come and they've gotten intertwined inside the food industry? And what type of practices have they brought in?
Yeah, so I mean, I have sort of I have mixed feelings about them. So the first thing is that you had two really big tobacco companies, RJR, which bought Nabisco, and then you had Philip Morris, which bought General Foods and Kraft. Philip Morris became the single largest maker of processed food in the United States, North America, from the late 80s through the early 2000s, when eventually they got out of the business. And you can see through the documents that I was able to obtain, the tobacco executives lending their expertise, first of all, their money, their incredible cunning at detecting those emotional buttons we just talked about, right? Because that's what smoking is sort of all about. Their money in putting into the money they had to put into research and development, and also their marketing skill. The tobacco companies were really good at forming relationships, we talked about, with corner stores and also with the front part of the grocery store at the checkout stand. So when the snack companies began making products, in fact, then they encouraged the snack companies that they own to start making products that could be sold at the checkout counter in the lanes when we're so vulnerable to making impulse decisions. And also the corner stores, I can tell you a story about that there, and maybe I should just do this if we have time, but I went to Philadelphia, a very poor neighborhood there, where a new principal of a school with kids who were struggling on their grades was trying to figure out why these kids were coming in the morning strung out, unable to pay attention, couldn't focus in class. And she followed them out the door one day, and they went from school to the corner stores that lined the school. She went to those corner stores and saw they were buying for, I think there was a study done for $1.06. They were buying 350 junky calories, mostly sugar. And they were going into these stores in the morning before school and then going back after school when they should be going home and working on their homework. She goes to the store, she goes, "Hey, can you guys just stop selling to my students, in the morning and the afternoon?" And the store owners go, "Well, no, not really. That's what we do, sell food." And so she organized parents to do an intervention. They were trained by organizations that used to teach people how to fight crack houses in the 80s.
Wow.
The parents stood outside with walkie-talkies talking to one another. And when they saw kids dashing to the store, they would call out to them, have a conversation about food, try to steer them away from the corner stores. I mean, that, the striking parallels there to,
That's great.
snack foods owned by the tobacco companies trying to be fought by parents using skills they developed, fighting crack houses was overwhelming to see.
It is.
So the other aspect of the food company, of the tobacco companies, though, is that one of the things I discovered is that toward the end of Philip Morris's ownership of Kraft, it became really concerned about Kraft's culpability for obesity. And privately, the tobacco companies went to their food managers and said, look, you guys, this is back in 2000, 2001, 2002, you guys are going to have as much trouble over obesity, diabetes, other health effects of your products as we are now over cancer. And you've got to do something to reduce your dependence on salt, sugar, fat, and all these other things for making your products so irresistible. So the tobacco companies, at the end of the day, recognized the problem that they were creating and actually tried to do a little something to turn the corner, if you will.
That's not actually surprising, since they probably had to fork over an awful lot of money as a result of their tobacco and cancers and heart disease and everything else like that.
There's that, absolutely.
Yeah, the crazy part is I never forget when I recognized and came into my new sense of enlightenment about nutrition and wellness and the power of that. I remember going to the grocery store, and I'm just like everyone else, but I had made this journey. I had all my fruits and vegetables and whole grains in my cart, and the shopping attendant, he was just like, man, you're the hell, and then at the last moment, right, just like in the movie, I reached for that aisle that was sitting there tempting me the whole entire time, because just like you said, they put it in that location, and I grabbed that candy, the same candy, by the way, that I had when I was a child, and put that little last bit, and the checkout attendant said, boy, I thought you were the healthiest person I'd ever seen until I saw you're just like the rest of us.
So we've mentioned, I love that story. Yeah, it's an impulse buying. And we've mentioned candy a couple of times, but one of the things that the food companies did when you talk to nutritionists that's most problematic is they didn't just engineer bliss points for soda and ice cream and cookies, treats, things we know that we should be eating as treats and not every day and not all the time. They marched around the grocery store adding sugar to things that didn't even used to be sweet, so that bread came to have added sugar and a bliss point for sweetness. Yogurts came to have as much sugar in them for serving as ice cream. Spaghetti sauce came to have the equivalent of a couple of Oreo cookies worth of sugar in a tiny half-cup serving. And what that did was create this expectancy in us that everything should be sweet. So when you drag yourself or your kids over to the produce aisle, where every nutritionist says we should be spending more time eating more broccoli and Brussels sprouts and celery, all those things that are good for us, but we're not eating enough of for really big reasons, much of them are due to the food companies. You're going to have a riot on your hand if you have kids, because they're going like, what's this sour taste? And what's this astringent taste? And where's my sugar? Because
exactly,
we become habituated to it. So I think that's been one of the biggest influences of the companies on our eating habits, was this ubiquity of sugar now in our lives.
Yeah, that, the one thing you said when I was researching for today, and I never knew this, never ran across this, is you mentioned about how the individual grocery stores, whatever the brand may be, are able to set the prices of the produce, whereas the convenience foods are a set price point. And so they can raise or lower it accordingly. So tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I mean, so the economics of food and are so important, but also very difficult to sort of grasp. And more power to Biden and Harris if they can sort of figure out a way to sort of change the current situation, which is that when we walk into the store, well-meaning, wanting to do good by ourselves and our family, invariably we bump up against a situation where a basket of blueberries costs as much as a 2-pound, 4 meat, 3 cheese, frozen pizza that's going to feed the whole family. And so push come to shove, which are you going to choose when you have a limited budget for food, as so many people do? And so, but the explanations for that are they're really complex. A lot of it goes back to all the money that the food companies, but also the government, pours into research and development to make ultra processed food cheaper. So little of that money goes into the produce aisle, so those blueberries can be cheaper. And yeah, the commodity aspect of produce, the grocers, I actually saw that as a positive thing, because the produce aisle is one of the more profitable parts of the grocery store. They can set the prices, but that could be a good thing if those prices are affordable to us, because then they're going to be more apt to pay more attention to the produce aisle and bring some really terrific vegetables in and keep them fresh, and maybe even do a little advertising for the vegetables. So it kind of cuts both ways in terms of the grocers' culpability in this whole mix.
Yeah, and that's a nice transition to, I mean, what's the hope in all this? I mean, what can we do? Are we prisoners of this ultra processed environment that we live in? Is there any hope to all this? How can we change the narrative?
You know, I mean, it's all about kids, I think. I mean, if we can, you know, we used to have home economics in school where girls, but also boys to some extent, were taught how to think about food, shop, do some cooking, mostly by scratch, right? That fell by the wayside in the 1980s for some reasons I write about in the book, and also because other societal problems became even greater than food at the time. I think a return to plugging food into the curriculum at school, not in a preachy nutrition, broccoli is good for you kind of a way, but in teaching food as power and empowerment. Just in this conversation we have today, kids get it. They understand that they can be doing things that companies are telling them to do, or they can be doing things that they can do for themselves. And if you have that conversation with kids, that can go all the way down to the elementary school level. So I think that's one of the things. If you're an adult trying to change your eating habits, I mean, the one thing to know is it takes time. I mean, you've had a lifetime of developing a bad habit, and you can't expect that to change overnight. Weight compounds itself. I have a terrific line of research in the next book where a very smart scientist discovered finally that as we gain weight, we become more sensitive, attracted to advertising and marketing, which are cues, psychologists call them. So two people driving on the road and they see the golden arches from McDonald's, they're going to have very different reactions to seeing that advertising, depending on how deep their habit is for the food. So you have to be patient. And maybe the third thing is, don't try to change everything at once. Maybe try to change one thing. Maybe it's sugary drinks, and try to tackle that for a while and shift your focus to other aspects. I love seltzer water, plain seltzer water, because it turns out, and this is one of the things that the companies stole from us, right? Seltzer was our invention. It came out of the ground. We'd been drinking it for centuries. The soda companies came along a century ago, added some sugar, wowed us, got us hooked on sugary soda. But one of the more powerful aspects of soda is actually the bubbles, because they get the brain excited just like sugar does. And I know this, I tried it on my teenager who, had a little bit of a sweet drink habit. We started drinking seltzer, and that was actually a pretty easy transition for him. So again, sort of in this notion of stealing back what they stole from us and using it to change our eating habits, I think could be a really positive change.
I love it. I love it. Not only just from what you said, because that's what I did to transition away from sodas and things like that about 10, 15 years ago, was adopting seltzer water, sparkling water to satisfy that craving and adding in fruit to it.
Good for
So
you.
extremely beneficial there. But what about you've done some work and shown before. I know Danette is on with us and has some questions for us, but about advertisers and about ways in which we can influence. If we put the power from all the commercials we see during Super Bowl towards good, maybe it would make a change.
So our purchase decisions, the companies are incredibly sensitive to those. And actually, I should say that 4 or 5 years ago, something really incredible happened. Enough people stopped buying enough of the junkiest products in the store that the companies panicked and they started to scramble to reduce their levels of salt, sugar, fat in their products. I think it's still an open question whether the food giants can play a meaningful role going forward and truly change the health profile of their products in a way that's significant for us. I think that question is still out. And one of the trickiest things out there now is that there's so many products that are ultra processed food pretending to be healthy that it's even trickier in that 90% of the middle part of the store in sort of sussing out what's good and what's bad. But absolutely, I don't think we're not going to wait for government to intervene to hold these companies to higher standards. It's going to be on us to change our purchase decisions, maybe the advertisers and pressure on them, but that's an industry too, and I'm not even sure they're going to be willing to change until enough of us are willing and able to change.
Let me just jump in before Danette says and say this. This is one of the reasons why what you write is so important, because we have to arm. African Americans have had a struggle around liberation for 400 years. And I think for a lot of our people, once they understand that in a sense, and this is why the title of our project is Slave Food, once they understand that in essence, just like the slaves were controlled by food, as Frederick Douglass explains, by the refuse, the foods that the master wouldn't eat, the intestines of pigs and things like that, once people today begin to understand that food is literally being used in a sense to hold them back. Because if you're not eating blueberries, which we now have studies that show enhances cognition, brain flow, and a lot of other things, instead you're eating, manufactured, pre-made, vanishing calorie density chip, your brain's not being fed, and someone is literally able to gain advantage over you in the competitive thing that is life, and life in America, especially for African Americans. What you're writing is in part, in a sense, like a nutritional underground railroad. People have to understand that they are on a plantation. And as much as I know the business of business is business, and I know that some of these companies are just looking for ways to make money, I think on the ground, when you look at the devastation that is caused, the relatives that I've buried myself, the amputees, the heart attacks, the strokes. I have not right now, taking care of many kids who just had a massive stroke. When you understand the human casualties, just like slavery, the food did for slaves, today it's the same thing. And so we really, we're really happy to have had you on to highlight, one, that this is something you need to be liberated from. You have to understand your role in getting off of the plantation as an individual, but two, that in fact, it isn't an accident. This isn't by chance. There are many things that are affecting us that were done so by design. And you can try and figure out whether or not these people are good or bad, but it doesn't matter. At the end of the day, we are the ones being ill-affected.
That's just such a huge thought. And I can't believe, as you were speaking, I apologize so much. The low battery sign just popped up on my laptop. So I can keep talking in hopes that it's going to hang on, or I could disappear for a minute and get my power code. I apologize for the potential disruption, because what you were saying was, it just puts this all into such a critical perspective, which is, and again, something that I was astounded at in this research that I've done for the last 10 years of writing about this industry, is how did we put so much power in the hands of these companies over something that's so important to our health, our well-being, our ability to do good things, to survive and thrive? how did we turn all of that over to them?
Mhm.
So why don't we go ahead and let you go get your power cord, and Eric, Eric, you can talk a little bit longer while we wait for him to come back. And we've got some questions that we would like to have you answer, but we would hate for you to get cut off while we're doing that. So we'll have
Fantastic.
taken off screen real fast, and then we'll let you do what you need to do, and then we'll have Eric continue if you would like on some
Yeah.
questions or statements you would like to make at this time.
Well, I would just say, I mean, when you listen to what was just said, and I like the fact that the two people we've had to address this issue have both said this is business. But I
Yeah.
think for the Slave Food Project, what we're trying to say to our people is you can't just allow them to have business, because their profits come at a cost to us.
Absolutely.
And we have to stand up and decide: are we going to have ourselves, our children, and their children be slaves to this food, and then slaves to we can't get into it. There's a whole other show. Slaves to the medical industrial complex. So you not only are you buying bag chips and box French fries all your life, now you got to buy bottles of pills and have procedures and so forth that you shouldn't have to have. And that is really at the crux of this. Who stands up and says enough is enough, and we're going to move on from this?
And the other thing is the whole stress thing, like, in terms of the stress eating and how the stress affects our community, and how we turn to like desserts, as stress fell backwards as a result of the environmental situations that we are not only, that we're dealing with. They don't only make it easy for us to reach for, but the environment causes us to reach for it a lot faster.
Yeah. And the other key thing is, I think it's important, just like what we're doing, to bring awareness to it, because I think in society, it's always a little bit won't hurt. Go ahead and have it. Go ahead and have it. And what we're doing is, I always say this to folks, is the fact that when we prescribe, Eric, we prescribe medications to individuals. A small dose for one person may be have a horrible adverse reaction. Another person may be able to tolerate a high dose before they get any adverse reaction. You never know how your body's reacting to the small dose of this ultra processed foods, of the various things that are out there that are targeted towards communities for the purpose of business. And that's why I think the work of Michael Moss is so important, because he's revealing and removing that veil that this is crazy. Psychobiologists.
When somebody just said moderation is a myth, and the only reason I jump in on that and I have to agree is there's no moderation for crack or for cocaine, and even alcohol. Even people who can drink it moderately and never have a problem with it, one life-changing event can sometimes cause a person who normally was able to completely control alcohol to someone who is over imbibing. And so these foods, when used as comfort foods, have that same potential, in my opinion. So there are people who can manage, and the loss of a loved one, loss of a job, whatever it takes, can transition them into overindulging in some of these foods.
It's a
Fantastic.
huge
My
point.
first question to Mr. Moss is, and it's in line with what was discussed. As an investigative reporter, what would you investigate as it relates to the food industry and the African American community?
I think it's what I've been doing, but even more looking at the health consequences of developing a habit for these products. I mean, addiction happens on a spectrum, and it can change over time. So, a product that can totally overwhelm one person at one time in their life, might be a product that someone else can manage and eat or drink with moderation, but maybe not forever, and maybe not when those external forces come back upon, come into their lives and cause them to sort of lose attention, because losing addiction to a problem, whether it's cigarettes or alcohol or drugs, takes an enormous amount of attention. It's when we lose that focus that we get in trouble and go back to sort of our old habits. So I think one thing I'd love to know more about is, what exactly will it take to sort of help people lessen their dependence on these hyper processed foods and shift over to a healthier diet? Is it smart marketing? Is it tastier but healthier food products? Could it be food engineering? More education? I mean, that's really what I want to know is what's the solution here? What will work? And what can, say, a new administration in Washington sort of do to sort of move this ball a bit in the next few years?
Well, I mean, I think one of the things I would jump in and say is you could quickly change things if the way we subsidize the giant cultural companies in this country, the way that they were subsidized. If we subsidized blueberries, watermelons, cucumbers, and lettuce, and made them basically, cheap and inexpensive to buy, that would be a start. I think the second thing, however, is, as you're saying, some of this has to be introduced. Someone in the comments mentioned food lunch programs and things like that. And in Pasadena, we actually had a farm at John Muir High School that the students actually farmed on and grew their own food and then sold. So there are programs that I think we could do all across the country to begin to do this. For African Americans, one of the things we preach is return to what we ate before we came to America, going back to the original diet of Africans. And I think that's true for most cultural groups, even Europeans in this country. If you went back far enough, you'd go back to food that came from the ground rather than from a plastic bag in the middle of the grocery store.
Yeah. And, one of the things that I oftentimes say in my clinic is, your impression of the clinical situation for a person who has broken bone, the plan should match that. I'm going to place in a cast. I'm going to send you the surgery. It should match that. And so I think as a nation, our impression, our plan are discordant. And so we're saying, yes, we want you to be healthy. We want you to partake of this healthy plate. But in our plan, our action is we subsidize the foods that are deleterious towards us. We sponsor and we build small business association loan, grant those. We provide advertisement. And so we create these environments that are discordant with our health and with our progress. And that's across
I
the
have to tell you,
national.
I have to tell you a really cool story I did a couple of years ago for my newspaper, the New York Times. I went to the Midwest, which is like corn and soybean country in the United States, and met young farmers who had left the farm, gone to the city, came back, but didn't want to grow more corn and soybeans for the processed food industry. They wanted to grow vegetables. And they had to go to school to learn to be farmers who could actually grow vegetables. And they were using a program helped by the federal government, actually Extension Service and the state governments, to learn how to do that. But the big problem they ran into was marketing. They were growing these luscious vegetables in Illinois, Indiana, apples and other fruits, but they didn't have a way to sell them because there weren't any farmers markets there yet. And so one of the big helps that the government could be is on the marketing side and that part of the food chain, the transportation, the selling, the marketing of those would be fabulous.
Okay, we have a question about, has the bliss point changed over the years? It seems to me that things are sweeter than when we were kids.
That's so interesting. I don't know the answer to that. It does change in people. So that, for example, the average bliss point for somebody in America is taking a 8-ounce glass of water and adding 6 teaspoons of sugar to it. That's the equivalent of sugar in a typical soda. But for kids, their bliss point is adding 5 more teaspoons until they get to 11 teaspoons of sugar in that glass of water. So for most people, as we age, our liking of sweetness decreases, but it's kind of all over the place. And some people love much more sugar than other people. But in terms of historical liking, I don't have the answer to that. It's really difficult to get precise. It's hard to know what we're eating even today, much less to go back in time to precisely know what people are eating.
Absolutely. One more question. I know we don't have time for many, but this one is, how do we create a resistance in the area, especially since we have fallen in love with these foods?
Yeah, I think so. To change a habit, the resistance meaning, hey, get those Cheetos away from me. So I think maybe one idea that makes sense to me, I'm certainly no expert though, is to first plan for that moment, because that craving is going to come on in a split second when you're not paying attention. So plan ahead, anticipate that it's going to happen. Think about what you have in the house within easy reach. And so maybe you don't want to have that snack food close to you, but then also find a way to shift that attention to something else. Maybe it's another food product. I mean, some people are able to eat carrot sticks and celery and be pretty satisfied. I kind of need more calories than that. So, instead of that junk snack, I'll have a handful of nuts, which have a fair amount of fat and calories, but it's all terrific for you. And I find that that's enough to sort of build up to sort of get that resistance to the junk food and take me to the next meal time. So it all depends on you and sort of how hooked you are on that junky food and what might draw your attention away in a way that satisfies you, because you can't depriving yourself, which so many diets do, ultimately is really difficult to stick with. Because again, when we're distracted by life, boom, we're right back to our original habits.
I'm gonna say this, and then I am gonna have to jump. But let me say this: I think in that question about resistance, we've watched during this pandemic since about June, when George Floyd was killed. We've watched these massive uprisings globally, quickly organized all over the globe. And I would argue, as necessary as those are, what would happen if we began to really ask hard questions through protesting around some of these industries that are causing disease, illness, and death in our communities? If our lives matter, I would argue there's probably not a place where it's more important to make sure that they are mattering than in the area of nutrition. Honestly. So, I think when it comes to resistance, I think of resistance as like political resistance. And I think that's necessary. And I'm hoping that the new White House will actually make some changes that'll help us all out as well.
Thank you. That's all for questions.
All right. So, I think that's one of the great things. I've extremely appreciated everything you've said. And one of the things I want to just highlight here additionally is that pre-mortem failure, that planning, that's a business motto of saying, what will I do? What excuse will I give as to why I was not successful in whatever my plan is? And then plan to offset that. And you outlined that beautifully in terms of identifying when you're stressed or when there's no food in the house or when you haven't had time to go get X, Y, and Z. What will you turn to then? So oftentimes for myself, I will drive around when I'm driving to a particular hospital or an area for a conference. I already map out what grocery stores are there, what types of restaurants are there, so I can plan mentally. Okay, you know what? I'm going to hit a X, Y, and Z grocery store and pick up these snacks for myself. So in that way, I'm not going to succumb to these things. So planning becomes so quintessential. So I have thoroughly enjoyed you kind of coming on here today, and I cannot wait to read the book Hooked. And I'm quite looking forward to it. I hope everyone who's joining in with us today will view and purchase your book, first of all, and purchase one for a friend, because we want to support the work that you're doing and going from there. But I think one last question I'll ask for you as we prepare to sign off is, leave us with last word of hope in 30 seconds or less.
Food is ours. We invented it. We developed cooking. We developed a love for food. And it's totally within our power to sort of take that back and use it for ourselves and not let the food industry dictate what we should be eating, where we should be eating. I'm totally optimistic and believing we can make that happen. And again, because no time has food mattered more, or how they manipulate us, than it does right now for our health and our well-being. So I really thank you for the time to talk. This has been really fun and powerful for me as well.
Yeah, love it, love it. Show the audience your book again and tell them where they can purchase it and maybe pre-order it in time for Christmas, an early Christmas gift.
It won't arrive by Christmas, but they can go to they can go to my website, which is Moss, my last name, books, MOSSBOOKS.US, and find ways to, they can read the reviews of the book, and they can read some other things that I've done, look at some videos, and pre-order the book as well.
Wow. Once again, thank you so much for being on with us. I enjoyed it. And what my word to the viewers out there is eat like a celebrity. You know, we all know celebrities by singular names. We know Barack, we know MJ, we know Madonna. Well, eat your broccoli, eat your kale, eat your blueberries, your spinach. These are singular name foods. And those are the things that will promote your health and help you overcome the burden of disease. But looking forward to seeing you the next time. We'll drop off for the holidays, but we look forward to seeing you back after the new year. And thank you again to Mr. Moss, an excellent investigative journalist. Appreciate you. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.